The house was quiet, too quiet for a place that cost more than most people earned in a decade. It wasn't the kind of silence that calmed. It was the heavy, echoing kind that made even footsteps feel like they didn't belong. Iris Wren stood in the hallway of the Dorn estate, barefoot, holding a steaming mug of chamomile tea she didn't really want. Her silk robe clung to her like an afterthought. The marble beneath her feet was cold. Everything in this place was beautiful, sterile, and lifeless. 3 years. That's how long she'd been married to Cassian Dorn. On paper, it looked perfect. She was elegant in public, poised at every gala, every boardroom dinner, always standing just behind him like a carefully chosen frame to a perfectly lit portrait. Her smile, muted and warm. Her eyes, trained to scan the room but never settle. She had become an expert in absence, being there, but not truly present. Their marriage had never been about love. It hadn't even been about companionship. It was structure, mutual advantage, silent agreements. She received financial stability and a new life far from the suffocating, small-town roots that had nearly crushed her spirit. He received a partner who didn't ask questions, who wouldn't demand affection or time, who would, above all, never cross the lines he'd drawn. And so she hadn't. Not once. The first few months had been tolerable. She told herself that people grow into love, that respect might blossom into something warmer if nurtured slowly. But time passed and nothing changed. They lived in separate wings of the house. He rose early, left for the office before she even stirred, returned late without knocking. They dined together only during public events. In the rare moments their paths crossed at home, his eyes flicked past her, polite and unreadable, like she was another curated piece of art hanging on his wall. He never touched her. Not once in 3 years. Not her hand, not her cheek, not a single brush of skin, not even in sleep. That was the part that confused people when she tried, once, to explain it to her brother Theo. "But he's your husband," Theo had said, trying to make sense of the absurdity. Iris just shook her head and said quietly, "No, I'm his wife. That's not the same." There were nights she stood in front of the mirror in their shared, but never truly shared, bedroom, examining her reflection like it belonged to someone else. She was still young, still whole, but she felt transparent, like someone who could fade out of a photograph and no one would notice. She had stopped writing, stopped reading the books she used to love. Even music felt too intimate, like it didn't belong in this kind of silence. Cassian never raised his voice. He never hurt her. He never accused, criticized, or controlled her in the obvious ways. But that was part of the problem. He treated her like a contract, not a person, like she was the answer to a logistical equation. His indifference wasn't violent, but it was violent in what it erased. And so on that October morning, when the sky was the color of tin and the trees outside had begun to curl their leaves inward like fists, Iris decided she couldn't do it anymore. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't plan a dramatic exit. Instead, she sat at the kitchen island, wrote a short letter in her small, slanted handwriting, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table where she knew he'd find it that evening. Then she went upstairs, packed 2 suitcases, one with clothes, one with her notebooks and a few worn books, and called a cab. No one stopped her. As the car pulled away from the estate, she didn't look back. There was nothing behind her that she wanted to see. The only thing that remained was the letter, and in it, only one paragraph that mattered. "I've spent 3 years being invisible beside you. I'm leaving not because I hate you, but because I can't afford to disappear. I hope someday you learn how to see the people who love you, not just their outlines." Cassian wouldn't chase her. She knew that. He didn't believe in chasing. He believed in order, in appearances, in measured responses. He wouldn't fall apart. He wouldn't call. He wouldn't come. But for the first time in her life, Iris didn't need anyone to come after her. She only needed to remember who she was before she became a shadow in someone else's story. The town Iris chose wasn't on a map most people kept. It was small, tucked along the coast of Maine like a forgotten sentence at the bottom of a page, and it didn't ask questions. That was why she picked it. It had nothing to do with Cassian's world. No glossy towers, no tailored suits, no echo of wealth or strategy. The streets were uneven and smelled of sea salt and pine, and the locals knew each other by name, not by salary. She rented the upstairs apartment of an old building that used to be a post office. The landlady, a retired piano teacher named Lorraine, gave her a discounted rate without asking for references. "You look like you need a quiet place," Lorraine had said, and Iris nodded because there was nothing else to say. Her first weeks in the town passed like fog. Mornings began with black coffee and the sound of seagulls clawing at the air outside her window. She walked to the library every day and applied for a part-time job the moment she saw the help wanted sign taped crookedly to the glass door. The librarian, a round-faced man named Glenn, who wore sweaters even in July, hired her without hesitation. "You look like someone who likes to be around books," he said, and she smiled. Not the fake, polished smile she'd worn for years, but something quieter and more human. She organized shelves. She mended bindings. She answered the same questions 100 times a week. "Where's the bathroom? Do you have the large print version? Can I renew this one more time?" And slowly, without warning, her body began to relax in ways she hadn't realized it was constantly tense. Her shoulders dropped. Her breath deepened. She started hearing her own thoughts again, unfiltered, not shaped for someone else's expectations. No one in town knew who she had been, and she didn't volunteer the information. When people asked why she'd moved here, she said, "I needed a reset," and they seemed to understand. Everyone had something they wanted to walk away from. Her days grew into a quiet rhythm. Work, reading, long walks by the shore. She picked up the habit of writing again, not with any goal, just scattered pages of thoughts and memories she didn't want to forget. Sometimes she wrote letters she never planned to send. Most of them were to Cassian. In those letters, she told him things she never had the courage to say aloud. She told him how it felt to stand beside him and not be seen. How she memorized his schedule just to feel close to something. How she once cried into her pillow after he brushed past her without looking up. She told him she didn't hate him. That was the hardest part to write, because she didn't. She had tried to, but hatred was loud and alive. And what she felt was quieter than that. What she felt was grief. She wrote about a version of him she imagined. The one who might have loved her if his world had been different. The boy he once was, before boardrooms and backlit screens and impossible expectations. Sometimes she wondered if he ever sat alone in their massive house, staring into the silence they had both fed like a wolf. But most days, she didn't think about him at all. One afternoon, while restocking a shelf in the children's section, a little girl with tangled blonde hair tapped her on the arm and asked if princesses could wear jeans. Iris knelt down and said, "Real ones do." The girl grinned and ran off. Iris stayed on her knees for a few seconds longer, hands still on the spine of a book, staring ahead like something had just uncoiled in her chest. She wasn't sure why that moment struck her, only that it did. That night, she sat by the window with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and watched the rain paint lines down the glass. She thought about the quiet she lived in now. It wasn't the same as the silence of her marriage. This quiet had space. It had air. It didn't erase her. She realized she had forgotten what that felt like, to exist without waiting for someone to acknowledge it. She still had the letter she left behind. She had rewritten it a dozen times in her head since. But if she were to write it again now, she thought it might end differently. Something like, "I didn't leave you to punish you. I left to remember myself. And I hope wherever you are, you're doing the same." She closed her notebook and turned off the light, letting the darkness come without fear. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone in it. The city hadn't changed, but Cassian had. Or maybe it had always been this relentless, this polished and sharp-edged, and he simply hadn't noticed until the silence she left behind became louder than anything he had ever heard. The days after Iris's departure bled into one another, like poorly folded pages in a book he didn't want to read. His life had not unraveled publicly. No press statement had been made. No scandal declared. The world assumed she was away for family reasons or taking time for herself. That's how cleanly he'd built the narrative around them. Precise, untouchable, sterile. But inside the penthouse overlooking the skyline, Cassian was not clean. He was raw. At first, he didn't realize she was gone. She disappeared so quietly, like she always did when she wanted to make herself smaller than the room. He came home late from a meeting and noticed the absence only in pieces. The missing shoes by the front door, the scent of her jasmine soap no longer lingering in the bathroom, the faint echo in the guest room she used more often than not. And then finally he found the letter. He read it once, then again, then again. Each time his eyes traced the words, he found something new in her handwriting. Not bitterness, but exhaustion. Not anger, but a kind of resignation that made his stomach twist. She hadn't left in fury. She had left because she had finally accepted that he would never see her the way she deserved to be seen. And that was worse than rage. That was proof of his failure, not just as a husband, but as a man. Still, he told no one. Not even Emery, his oldest friend and legal counsel. He went about his business as if everything was intact, attending board meetings, reviewing quarterly reports, shaking hands at charity functions. But something about him had changed, and those who knew him best began to notice. His answers were slower, more distracted. His gaze drifted out windows during conference calls. His tone, always so measured, carried an edge that hadn't been there before. His assistant asked if he was ill. He said no, but he was. Just not in a way medicine could fix. The nights were the worst. He had always been comfortable alone. Solitude was a shield he wore proudly. But now it mocked him. Now it echoed. He walked the halls of his home like a ghost, passing rooms where she used to sit and read, or rest her tea beside a book she would never finish. Her presence lingered in the details, and they haunted him. The unopened book she had left on the windowsill, the sweater still draped across the back of a chair, the framed photograph she had once placed in the hallway, a small, candid shot of a mountain trail they'd walked together on a rare weekend trip. He'd forgotten it existed. She hadn't. It took him 2 weeks to admit she wasn't coming back. Not on her own, and when he said the words aloud to the emptiness of his living room, they sounded foreign, final. Like the closing of a door he hadn't realized he left open. He tried to work through it the way he handled everything else, analytically. He made lists, reread their conversations, reconstructed their last month together as if searching for a missed signal. He even considered hiring someone to find her, not out of control but out of desperation. But he stopped himself before taking that step, because deep down he knew this wasn't something he could fix with logistics or resources. Emery came by one night after hearing from someone in the office that Cassian had missed 2 meetings in a row. That was unheard of. He found Cassian sitting in the dark, a glass of something untouched in his hand, staring at nothing. When Emery asked what was going on, Cassian didn't answer right away. Then he said simply, "She left, and I let her." Emery didn't react with surprise. He had always known there was something not quite right about the way Cassian treated his wife. Not cruel, but detached. She had seemed too quiet, too isolated, like someone whose soul was slowly being folded into smaller and smaller corners. "Did you love her?" Emery asked, careful. Cassian didn't blink. "I didn't know how." Emery nodded and sat down beside him without another word. For a long time they just sat there, 2 men in silence, one of them grieving something he never admitted he wanted. That night after Emery left, Cassian opened Iris's closet and sat on the floor beside it. Not to find anything, not to cling, just to be where she had once stood. He touched the fabric of her coat sleeve and whispered into the stillness, "I didn't know I was lonely until you were gone." And for the first time in his adult life, Cassian Dorn cried. Not for the image he had built or the perfection he had maintained, but for the woman he never held, the words he never said, and the years he could not get back. Cassian didn't pack a suitcase. He didn't alert his team, didn't notify his board, didn't delegate authority. He simply left. For the first time in his life, he walked out of his office in the middle of the day without a reason. The assistants looked confused, the security staff shifted uncertainly as he passed, and Emery, mid-call in the conference room, watched him from the glass wall with narrowed eyes. But no one stopped him. Cassian Dorn didn't owe anyone explanations. Until now, he never had to. He booked a flight that afternoon and arrived in Maine after dark, stepping off the plane not like a man on a mission, but like someone walking into a place they'd only ever seen in dreams. The town was quiet, the roads narrow and unfamiliar. He didn't know exactly where she was. He hadn't hired a private investigator, hadn't pulled strings or hacked records. All he had was the return address on a postcard she had once mailed her brother from a local bookstore, tucked years ago into a drawer he never opened. The memory of it struck him one night as he sat staring at the blank space across from his bed, and he'd taken it as a sign, not of where she wanted to be found, but of where she had chosen to breathe. He rented a house on the edge of town. Nothing extravagant, just 2 bedrooms and an aging porch with peeling white railings and a view of the sea. It felt like something she might have liked. Weathered, quiet, a place that didn't apologize for its imperfections. He didn't ask around. He didn't want to draw attention or create ripples in the life she had built without him. He only needed to see it for himself. Her new world. The version of her that didn't flinch when she laughed. For days he wandered the town without purpose. He walked by the harbor, along sidewalks lined with flower boxes and sun-faded shop signs. He bought coffee from a place with crooked tables and handwritten menus, and sat there in the mornings, watching strangers read newspapers and wipe crumbs from their children's mouths. The people here moved slower. They didn't scan the room or measure every glance. They didn't have anything to prove. It unnerved him at first. Then it made him ache. He saw her on the fourth morning. She was across the street, standing in the window of the town's library, laughing at something someone had said. Her head was tilted slightly back, her hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck, and she looked free. It stopped him in his tracks. There was no version of her in his memory that matched the woman he saw now. She had always been so contained, so composed. But here she was unguarded. She smiled with her eyes. She touched someone's arm when she spoke. She existed. He didn't go inside. He didn't speak. He watched for a few moments longer, then turned and walked the long way back to the rental. That night he sat in the quiet of the house and wrote a letter he would never send. In the letter he told her that he didn't come to bring her back. He didn't come to win or explain or promise change. He came because he wanted to understand what he had broken and what she had built after she'd escaped. He told her that he had started therapy, that Emery had made the call for him, but he'd kept going. He wrote about his childhood, how no one ever touched unless it was for correction or control, how silence had been the only thing that kept the walls from collapsing, how he thought if he kept still enough, he wouldn't be seen, and therefore couldn't be hurt, and how he learned eventually to make himself the quietest person in every room, until it became natural to forget other people had voices at all. He wrote that he now realized he had married her not because he didn't care, but because she was the only person who didn't push into his space with force. She had simply stood there, patient and unassuming, and he had mistaken that grace for someone who didn't need anything. But she had needed to be loved, to be known, and he had failed her. He ended the letter with something simple. I see you now, and I hope someday, if nothing else, you know that. He folded the letter and placed it under a book beside his bed. Then he turned out the light and lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of the ocean scratching against the rocks below. He didn't know if he would ever be brave enough to approach her, but for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about control or strategy or outcomes. He was thinking about grace, about stillness, about what it meant to stay in one place long enough for someone to look at you and see a man, not a shadow. And in that small, rented house at the edge of her world, he waited. Not for her to come to him, but for the moment when he would finally be worthy of walking toward her. The morning she saw him, Iris was carrying a box of returned books from the library drop slot, her arms wrapped tightly around the cardboard edges as she stepped out onto the front steps. The weight was manageable, but awkward, and she had to pause halfway down to shift her grip. When she looked up, her breath caught. Across the street, leaning against the corner of the bakery, stood Cassian. He didn't look out of place, but he didn't belong either. His clothes were simpler than she remembered. No tailored suit, no polished leather shoes, just a dark wool coat and jeans, and his hands shoved into the pockets as if trying to hold something inside. His hair was longer, slightly unruly from the wind, and there was something different in his face, something less rigid. But his eyes were unmistakable, and they were looking directly at her. For a second, everything inside her slowed. She didn't move. He didn't wave. There was no dramatic crossing of the street, no theatrical moment. He simply nodded once, gently, as if acknowledging her presence with reverence, not expectation. And then, just as calmly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away down the street, disappearing into the turn by the flower shop. She stood there for several seconds longer, still holding the box, her arms now shaking, not from the weight, but from something else entirely. Inside the library, Glenn called her name, asking if she needed help, but she didn't answer immediately. When she finally did move, it was with quiet deliberation. She took the books inside, stacked them behind the counter, and excused herself to the back room, where she sat on a wooden stool and stared at the floor for a long time. He was here, not because someone had told him to come, not because it benefited him in some way, but because he had chosen to be here. She hadn't seen his face in months. She hadn't heard his voice in longer. And yet the second their eyes met, something old and buried inside her stirred, not with longing or anger, but with a quiet ache she had learned to live around. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She shelved books, helped an elderly man find an out-of-print biography, and read to a group of children at story hour. Her hands moved through each task, but her mind was elsewhere, circling the image of him on that corner. What was he doing here? What did he want? And why hadn't he said anything? That evening, as the sky dimmed and the wind began to pull at the corners of buildings, Iris returned to her apartment and found an envelope on her doorstep. No name, no stamp, just her address, written in familiar, blocky handwriting. She didn't open it right away. She carried it inside like a fragile thing, placed it on the table, and made herself a cup of tea, letting the warmth ground her before she sat down and unfolded the letter. It was his handwriting, neat, restrained, no wasted words. But unlike the man she remembered, this letter was not built of distance. It was raw in a way she hadn't expected. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask to be seen. He simply offered himself piece by broken piece. He wrote about the silence, the way he had mistaken her quiet grace for detachment, when in fact it had been the deepest form of love he'd ever been given. He wrote about his childhood, about the absence of affection, about how touch had always come with conditions or punishments. He admitted that he had never learned how to let someone close without fear of crumbling, and that she had deserved so much more than the fortress he'd built around himself. There was no manipulation in the letter, no pressure, only reflection, only truth. At the end he wrote, "I am not asking you to come back. I am not asking you to forgive me. I only hope that you can read these words and know that I see you now, fully, clearly, and that seeing you has changed me." Iris set the letter down and closed her eyes. The silence in the room was different now, not empty, full. She didn't cry, she didn't smile. She simply breathed, long and deep, as if her lungs had forgotten how to function freely until now. She didn't know what this meant. She didn't know if she wanted to see him again, or if she was ready to speak to him. But something in her had softened, not toward him, but toward the memory of herself that had once stood beside him, invisible and yearning. That woman had been brave. That woman had left not out of cruelty, but because she knew her worth. And now as the first stars blinked into the sky outside her window, Iris whispered something into the quiet. Not a promise, not a decision, just a single truth she could finally admit. He had finally spoken the language she had waited years to hear, and she had heard it. It was a Sunday morning when Iris saw him again, this time not from across the street or through glass, but in the real and ordinary setting of a quiet cafe. She had gone there early before the crowd, intending to sit by the window with a book and a cinnamon scone, her favorite routine when the air was cool and the fog still clung to the sidewalks. She didn't expect to see him there, and from the way Cassian looked up as she entered, surprised, almost uncertain, neither had he. But he didn't get up or call her name. He only met her eyes, nodded with a restraint that bordered on reverence, and then lowered his gaze to the black coffee cooling in his hands. She could have walked away. A few weeks ago she might have. But something in his stillness, his refusal to chase or demand, the quiet surrender of his presence, made her pause. Without speaking, she approached the table and sat down across from him. She didn't take off her coat. She didn't smile. She just watched him, as if trying to understand the man he'd become since the last time she'd heard his voice echo through the hollow rooms of their marriage. Cassian didn't rush to speak. He gave her the dignity of silence first, the space to choose whether the moment would continue or end. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she remembered. Not fragile, but stripped of armor. "I wasn't sure you'd stop," he said, his eyes still lowered. "I wouldn't have blamed you if you didn't." Iris tilted her head, studying him. "You've been here for how long?" "Almost 3 weeks," he said, glancing up only for a moment. "I didn't want to interfere. I just wanted to see what peace looked like on you." She didn't know what to do with that sentence. It was so far from the Cassian she had known, the man who once measured words like currency and offered nothing that didn't serve a clear purpose. He looked thinner, not physically, but emotionally, less tightly held together, more honest. You could have said something, she said. Before now. I didn't think I had the right to, he replied. Not after everything I didn't say before. The words sat between them, heavy but without accusation. Iris wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic mug the server placed in front of her and took a slow breath. She had rehearsed what she might say to him in her mind a dozen times since reading the letter. Sharp, clean things that would reassert her strength and independence. But none of those lines seemed useful now. Not when she was sitting in front of someone who no longer seemed interested in winning. I read your letter, she said at last. He nodded. I hoped you would. It hurt, she added more quietly. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest. I didn't think you were capable of that. I wasn't, he admitted. Not then. I had no idea how to look at someone and let them look back at me without it feeling like danger. There was a pause, a long one. And then Iris asked the one question that had hovered in her chest since the day she left him. Why did you marry me? Cassian looked up, fully this time, and the answer came without hesitation. Because you were kind to me, and I was so used to earning everything through force, I didn't know what to do with kindness that expected nothing in return. You never tried to break me open. You just stood there quietly waiting. And I mistook your gentleness for something small. I didn't realize how strong you were until you walked away. The words reached her like waves, slow, steady, undeniable. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to protect herself from him. He wasn't reaching across the table. He wasn't making promises. He wasn't asking her to come back. He was simply sitting in front of her, stripped of pretense, offering her the dignity of truth. I don't know what you want from me now, she said carefully. Nothing you don't want to give, he said. I don't need to rewrite what happened. I just want to be near the version of you I never bothered to meet. She exhaled slowly, eyes falling to the table between them. It felt like standing on the edge of a frozen lake, wondering whether the ice could hold her weight. And yet, there was a stillness in her chest she hadn't expected, a lack of fear. Not because she was ready to forgive or forget, but because for the first time, she didn't feel like she was the one who needed to bend. I don't know what this is, she said. Neither do I, he answered, his voice steady, but I'm willing to learn. She didn't say yes. She didn't reach for his hand. She didn't give him anything he hadn't already earned through silence and patience. But when she left the cafe that morning, she didn't walk away with her back turned. She looked at him. She met his eyes, and he stayed seated, unmoving, letting her have the last word without speaking it. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a love story rediscovered. It was something smaller, quieter, more precious. It was a beginning. The weeks that followed were delicate, stitched together by unspoken boundaries and a mutual understanding that neither of them wanted to rush into anything that resembled the past. Iris did not invite Cassian into her apartment. He did not ask. Instead, they met in neutral spaces. Public gardens, bookstores, the quiet cafe where their first conversation had unfolded. They didn't call it anything. It wasn't dating. It wasn't rebuilding. It was simply two people relearning how to speak, this time not as husband and wife, but as man and woman with a shared silence between them that they were both beginning to respect. Cassian had changed, not in a dramatic or performative way, but in the subtle erosion of the walls he had once built so carefully around himself. He didn't interrupt anymore. He didn't try to steer conversations or redirect emotions into safer territory. He listened. He asked questions, sometimes awkwardly, like a man relearning a language he should have known all along. Iris noticed these things not because they were loud, but because they were small and real. He paid attention to the way she liked her tea, the way she never wore the same earrings twice, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was deciding whether to speak or stay silent, and she, in turn, allowed herself to soften. Not completely, not carelessly, but enough to stop bracing every time he opened his mouth, enough to believe that perhaps she wasn't waiting for him to disappear again. Trust wasn't handed back. It was earned moment by moment in the spaces between conversations and in the long walks along the shoreline where nothing had to be said. One evening after the library had closed and the last of the late autumn sun had dipped behind the hills, Cassian waited for her on the bench outside. He had made a habit of walking her home, though home was still a word he used cautiously. Iris appeared with her coat half-buttoned and a scarf looped hastily around her neck. She looked tired in the way that meant she'd been busy, not broken. They walked slowly. The town was quiet, the streets mostly empty except for the occasional dog walker or teenager on a bicycle. Cassian glanced at her as they passed a row of shuttered storefronts and asked, without looking directly at her, "Do you ever miss it?" Iris didn't have to ask what he meant. "The city," she replied after a pause. "Sometimes the museums, the late-night jazz clubs, the kind of anonymity that lets you disappear without anyone noticing." Cassian nodded. "You always liked that part, didn't you?" "I did," she said, "until I realized I'd been disappearing too long." They reached the end of the street where the sidewalk narrowed, leading toward her building. She stopped first, her hand resting on the iron railing that bordered the stairs. He turned to face her fully for the first time that evening. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. She watched him carefully as he pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. It was worn, clearly used, the edges softened with time. He handed it to her without explanation. "What is this?" she asked, fingers brushing the cover. "I started writing it after you left," he said. "Not about you, about me. Things I never said, things I didn't know how to say. I didn't think I'd ever show it to anyone, but I think maybe it was always meant for you." She didn't open it. She didn't have to. The weight of it in her hands was already enough. "I'm not giving it to you because I want something in return," he added. "It's just, if you ever wonder what's different now, it's all in there." Iris looked at him then, long and searching, and he didn't shrink from it. He stood still, no longer trying to be impressive or untouchable. He let her look, and he let her decide. "Thank you," she said simply. There was no kiss, no touch, no sweeping gesture to mark the moment. Just a quiet exchange between two people learning to live in the open after years spent behind walls. Later that night, in the privacy of her apartment, Iris sat by the window and opened the journal. The first page was blank except for one line, written in his precise, deliberate handwriting. "This time, I want to be someone who knows how to stay." She closed the book again, pressed it to her chest, and let herself feel the slow, quiet shift inside her. Not certainty, not surrender, but a soft and steady pull towards something that had once been broken and might just be whole again someday. The first snow came early that year, dusting the rooftops and bare trees in a soft white layer that seemed to quiet even the sound of passing cars. Iris stood by the window of her apartment, watching the flakes fall in lazy spirals, her breath fogging the glass. The town looked like something out of a postcard, still, hushed, perfect in its imperfection. Behind her, the kettle began to whistle gently, and she turned away from the view to pour 2 mugs of tea, placing one on the table across from her own. Cassian sat there, thumbing slowly through a novel he had picked up from the library, the kind with worn pages and cracked spine, the kind he never would have touched a year ago. He wasn't reading, not really. He was waiting for her. They had built something, though they still didn't name it. It was not the marriage they had once pretended to have. It was not a second chance in the dramatic, romantic sense. It was something quieter, more fragile, but also more honest. He came over sometimes with no plan and left with no expectation. She let him in without a performance, without makeup, without needing to fill the silences. They talked about small things, the books they were reading, the people they passed on the street, the strange comfort of falling asleep to the sound of wind against the windows. But sometimes the conversation deepened unexpectedly, like stepping into water that looked shallow, but suddenly pulled at the knees. On this particular evening, as the snow continued to fall and the sky turned the color of charcoal, Iris set her mug down and looked at him. She had been thinking about this for days, maybe weeks, but she hadn't found the words until now. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to imagine what it would be like to be seen by you. I mean, really seen. Not as someone polite enough to stand beside you, but as someone you might reach for, just because you wanted to." He didn't answer right away. He closed the book gently, resting it on the table, and met her gaze with something deeper than apology. "Iris," he said, her name slow and deliberate, as if it still felt sacred in his mouth. I think I spent most of my life mistaking distance for control. I thought if I held everything tightly enough, I'd never lose anything. But I lost you because I never let myself have you in the first place. She nodded, not because she needed him to say more, but because she understood. They had both been trying to survive versions of themselves that no longer existed. She had once needed to be needed quietly, without burdening anyone. And he had once needed to be untouchable, convinced that closeness equaled risk. But now they sat across from one another in a room that was neither grand nor lonely, sipping tea while snow fell softly outside, and neither of them needed to prove anything anymore. He reached across the table then, not abruptly, but with the kind of care that comes from having known what it feels like to be too late. His hand rested lightly over hers and she didn't pull away. The touch was simple, human, warm. "I'm not asking to rewrite the past," he said. "I only want to keep showing up in the present for as long as you'll let me." Iris looked down at their hands, at the quiet way they fit together, and felt something unfold inside her. Not like a door swinging open, but like light slipping beneath it. She didn't say yes. She didn't make any promises, but she did something neither of them had ever done before. She leaned forward and placed her head gently against his shoulder. He exhaled as though he'd been holding that breath for years, and laid his cheek softly against her hair. There were no grand declarations, no epic music swelling in the background. Just two people in a quiet room, in a quiet town, listening to the quiet fall of snow, finally still enough to hear the sound of their own hearts learning how to stay. And in that moment, it was enough.